How America's $38 trillion debt became a systemic risk begins with a contradiction that history keeps hiding in plain sight. The most powerful nation in the modern world is not collapsing because it is weak, invaded, or technologically surpassed. It is straining under success. For decades, the United States was taught to believe that debt at the sovereign level was harmless, even virtuous, a sign of trust, stability, and global dominance. Yet every major financial collapse in recorded history followed the same pattern. Power converted into promises, promises multiplied into obligations, and obligations eventually exceeded reality. What makes this moment different is scale. Never before has a single country carried obligations so vast that their failure would not merely shock markets, but destabilize the operating system of global finance itself. How America's $38 trillion debt became a systemic risk is not a story of reckless spending alone. It is a story of moral asymmetry, where sacrifice is demanded from citizens while insulation is built for institutions, where consequences are delayed just long enough to feel abstract. The past is not behind us in this cycle, it is looping forward. And the question is no longer whether the pressure exists, but who absorbs it when the system exhales. This is macro threshold, where money, power, and history converge. The narratives explored here do not seek outrage, comfort, or ideology. They trace the silent mechanics beneath headlines, the long arcs beneath short-term data, and the repeating structures that survive empires. Macro threshold examines moments when systems quietly cross points of no return, when what once felt sustainable becomes irreversible, and when collective belief collides with arithmetic. The stories are not predictions, they are reconstructions. Because understanding where power has flowed before is often the only way to recognize where it is moving next. How America's $38 trillion debt became a systemic risk matters now because the conditions that once made American debt a stabilizing force have inverted. The cause is not a single administration, crisis, or policy, but a structural dependence on perpetual expansion of obligations to preserve the appearance of stability. The effect is a financial architecture that requires constant intervention to function normally, where interest rates, liquidity, and confidence must be managed simultaneously to avoid fracture. The consequence is subtle but profound. Debt is no longer a tool within the system. It is the system. This transformation was visible in moments like the abandonment of the gold standard, the explosion of treasury issuance after 2008, and the normalization of emergency monetary policy as a permanent feature. Each step reduced friction, increased flexibility, and expanded scale. Each step also narrowed the margin for error. When a system grows large enough, its failure stops being a possibility and becomes a parameter. The debt was meant to protect the system. Now the system exists to protect the debt. How America's $38 trillion debt became a systemic risk is not about excess alone, but about dependence disguised as resilience. How America's $38 trillion debt became a systemic risk feels different when experienced from the inside. There was a time when borrowing felt distant, abstract, managed by professionals somewhere above everyday life. Growth felt steady, credit was cheap, opportunity seemed endless. Then the excess arrived quietly. Asset prices surged faster than wages. Stability became conditional on intervention. Crises no longer reset the system, they expanded it. The rupture came not as collapse, but as normalization of emergency. Trillions appeared without debate. Deficits lost meaning. The debt ceiling became theater. Eventually, the realization surfaced that nothing was being paid down, only rolled forward, extended, reframed. The collapse never arrived, but neither did resolution. What remained was a constant hum of fragility, a sense that the structure held only because everyone agreed not to test it. The echo of that realization is persistent. Confidence still exists, but it is thinner. Trust remains, but it is managed. And beneath daily function sits an unspoken awareness that the margin between control and consequence has narrowed to a historical minimum. How America's $38 trillion debt became a systemic risk is lived not as panic, but as permanent exposure. How America's $38 trillion debt became a systemic risk is not unique in structure, only in magnitude. One empire once financed global dominance through silver flows until debasement hollowed its core. El patrón no cambia, solo cambia el nombre del imperio. Another projected strength through bonds and colonial revenue until debt outpaced extraction and credibility fractured. El patrón no cambia, solo cambia el nombre del imperio. A third preserved stability by monetizing obligations until inflation replaced default as their release valve. El patrón no cambia, solo cambia el nombre del imperio. In each case, the system did not fail where observers expected. It failed where belief exceeded capacity. The names changed, the instruments evolved, the pattern endured. How America's $38 trillion debt became a systemic risk sits at the same inflection point, scaled to a world where the consequences no longer stop at borders. How America, foreseeing its $38 trillion debt became a systemic risk, reaches its moment of revelation not through scandal or collapse, but through a structural truth that was always present and simply postponed. There's a silence inside every financial system when it crosses a certain scale, a point where questions stop being asked because the answers would destabilize belief itself. The revelation is not that the United States is indebted. It is that the global financial architecture has evolved to require American debt as its stabilizing mass. The debt is no longer a consequence of policy choices. It is the central load-bearing element of the system. Remove its growth, slow its expansion, or question its permanence, and the mechanisms designed to distribute risk instead concentrate it. How America's $38 trillion debt became a systemic risk is revealed in this inversion. The system does not protect the economy anymore. The economy is organized to protect the system. Debt stopped being a tool and became terrain. It became the ground on which markets, currencies, pensions, governments, and expectations stand. The pause before this realization is where most societies lose their footing. For decades, expansion functioned as reassurance. Each crisis was answered with more liquidity, more issuance, more guarantees. Each intervention worked, not because it solved the underlying imbalance, but because it bought time. Over time, time itself became the primary policy instrument. The revelation arrives when time stops feeling abundant. Interest costs begin to compete with legitimacy. Monetary control becomes reactive rather than directional. Fiscal debates turn theatrical because outcomes are structurally constrained. How America's $38 trillion debt became a systemic risk is revealed in the simple arithmetic that no longer needs to be spoken aloud. Stability now depends on continuous confidence in an obligation that cannot shrink without consequence. The danger is not default, the danger is dependence. How America's $38 trillion debt became a systemic risk is no longer theoretical when connected to the present. The system's pressure is visible not in collapse, but in calibration. Inflation becomes policy's shadow. Asset inflation becomes social stratification. Volatility becomes normalized language. Every sector adapts quietly. Savers adjust expectations downward. Institutions adjust risk models upward. Governments adjust narratives sideways. What once would have been labeled emergency measures are now standard responses. Liquidity facilities, balance sheet expansions, deficit financing, and coordinated intervention no longer signal crisis. They signal continuity. How America's $38 trillion debt became a systemic risk is lived as a background condition, not an event. The system remains functional, but it is no longer flexible. It moves forward because reversal would expose fragility that belief alone can no longer mask. Collective participation is now mandatory. Foreign governments hold American debt not as investment, but as reserve architecture. Pension systems depend on its stability, not for return, but for solvency. Financial institutions rely on it as collateral, benchmark, and anchor simultaneously. Citizens interact with its consequences through prices, housing, wages, and credit without ever touching the instrument itself. This is how systemic risk operates, invisibly, impersonally, and everywhere at once. How America's $38 trillion debt became a systemic risk is not about a single failure point, but about the elimination of exit routes. When every participant depends on the same structure, adjustment replaces choice. Policy becomes constraint management rather than strategy. There is no moment when the system announces this transition. It reveals itself through behavior. Political polarization intensifies because distribution becomes zero-sum. Markets react sharply to language rather than fundamentals. Confidence requires constant signaling. Small shocks demand large responses. The system can still absorb stress, but only by transferring it forward. The future becomes the balancing mechanism for the present. How America's $38 trillion debt became a systemic risk is exposed in this temporal shift. Prosperity is borrowed not only financially, but chronologically. Growth is pulled forward. Stability is prepaid with obligations that narrow tomorrow's options. The echo of history is unmistakable, even when the instruments are new. Every empire that reached this phase believed it had transcended the cycle through sophistication, scale, or innovation. Each believed that credibility could substitute for capacity indefinitely. Each discovered that systems do not collapse because people stop believing in them, but because belief is eventually asked to carry more weight than it can sustain. The present does not require catastrophe to change outcomes. It requires only adjustment. Adjustments redistribute pressure. They redefine security. They alter contracts, implicitly or explicitly. How America's $38 trillion debt became a systemic risk is not a prophecy of collapse, but a diagnosis of threshold, a point where continuation demands trade-offs that can no longer be hidden. The closing lesson is neither alarmist nor ideological. It is structural and historical. Systems built on perpetual expansion eventually trade growth for maintenance, opportunity for obligation, and flexibility for control. Awareness does not dismantle the system, but it alters the relationship to it. Understanding the structure does not eliminate risk, but it reframes responsibility. How America's $38 trillion debt became a systemic risk completes its circle here, where the opening contradiction resolves into clarity. The past is not repeating mechanically, it is rhyming structurally. The present is not collapsing dramatically, it is compressing quietly. And the future will not ask whether the system was understood, only whether its price was anticipated. If this examination sharpened perception rather than comforted assumption, remain attentive. Systems rarely announce their limits. They reveal them through pressure. How America's $38 trillion debt became a systemic risk is not the end of the story. It is the moment the cost of continuity becomes visible.